Welcome to Whitetail Rendezvous, hosted by Bruce Hutchin. I'm so happy you've joined us today, and you're going to find out a lot about whitetail hunting on the show. This is Whitetail Rendezvous, episode number 360. On today's episode, we welcome Art Helin. Art has traveled around the United States giving advice on how to grow great bucks. He also has been a noted author. Peterson's Hunting, North American Hunter, Wisconsin Sportsman Magazine, just to name a couple. Plus, he is a platform speaker. I ran into him at the Iowa Deer Classic a couple weeks back. So Art has great stories. He's got great insight, what it takes to grow mature bucks. So pay attention. Get your pad and paper out because he's going to give you some insights you might not have heard before. He's going to talk about the phases of the rut. It's never too early to think about food plots. Whitetail Rendezvous has an ebook for you. Just simply text 33444 food plot to get your copy. Welcome to Iowa Deer Classic, Des Moines, Iowa. This is Bruce Hutchin, your host, and I'm sitting here with Art Helin. And Art, tell us what's going on at Whitetail Deer Classic.
Right now, the Deer Classic has been amazing. It's packed. I didn't get in until this morning on Saturday morning due to some other things I had going on. But speaking here today and just looking at the crowd, it's just been a steady crowd all day long, and seems to be good. Everybody seems to be in a good mood and spending money and having fun.
How many people do you think are here today at the Iowa Deer Classic?
Wow, I'm not good at guessing like that, but I would, if it's average, I'm guessing they have to have 4,000 or 5,000 people or more here walking through these doors today.
Yeah, and I was fortunate enough to listen to Art early this morning in his seminar. So why don't you just take us through a couple of snippets? We're going to be here about 20 minutes, and we're going to talk a lot about, whitetail deer hunting here in the Midwest. But Art, kind of run us through the high points of the seminar you gave actually twice today.
Well, I gave the first seminar I did today was on deer vocalizations, and I broke down the seasons of deer vocalizations on when and when not to use different things. Because if you use rattling, if you use social grunts and different calls throughout the wrong time of year, they're not going to be as effective. So we tried to break down dates and seasons as far as pre-rut, rut, post-rut. And as far as early season, right when deer are starting to come out of velvet, and break down the different calls used anywhere from doe bleats to estrus bleats to rattling and social grunts to tending grunts and your challenge grunts. So that seminar we kind of broke things down into different phases throughout and talked about the different types of calls used and why they were effective and why they weren't. The second one I did was on land management and the 4 must-haves, which we broke down into the 4 different parts of food, water, cover, and sanctuaries. We talked about timber stand improvement work throughout and difference between hinge cutting and stump cutting. We talked about stump sprouts and which ones are good for deer and which ones aren't, how they create different cover, different bedding areas. We broke down water and why there's certain areas of water or types of water that are better than others, why deer walk through creeks to go to certain, man-made small mini ponds that are, 15 by 15 feet or 20 by 20 feet by 4 feet deep. And working with different aquatic biologists and foresters, gathering all that information over years of time, trying to find out why they did certain things, and then finally bringing it to a head and explaining to people why deer are doing what they're doing. Sanctuaries and why you need to stay out of them after July. You'd like to stay out of them. The end of July, deer come in, and what they do is they'll start breaking out of their bachelor groups and going back to their home ranges or finding new home ranges. And if you're in these certain areas and you're pushing these mature deer out of there, those mature deer are going to move, 20, 40, 60 acres away, which may not be on your property anymore. And so why the importance of having certain sanctuaries and what to do in a sanctuary. And then the last puzzle was food sources and why we as hunters need to quit acting like farmers or think that we're farmers and become deer farmers and look at more 365-day-a-year food sources instead of just straight corn and beans. If we want to use corn or beans, how to supplement that with clovers and brassicas, chicories, different food sources to make those deer want to come back to those certain areas to feed, that full 365 days.
So if somebody wants to get a hold of Art, what's the best way to reach you? Social media? Do you have an office phone or email address and website?
The best, there's a couple ways. On Facebook, you can go to my Art Helin Outdoors Facebook page, friend me there, or like that. You can also email me at art@Art Helin Outdoors. That's HELIN outdoors.com. Or you can check out my website, which is www.arthelinoutdoors.com. And then on that, you can get to the contact page and get a hold of me.
Let's give a little shout out for John O'Brien. John's a good friend of mine, and I know you're doing some work with him. So what part does John play in what you're doing?
Well, John O'Brien, I met John and started working with John on food sources once I figured out his agronomy background, and we started talking. And John, I've worked with some really good guys in the past, but when John started breaking down, mineral content in plants and protein in plants, and how at certain times of the year that he does certain tests to do things, he was way over my head. Everything that I'd ever known about it and stuff. I mean, he was things he was saying, I just, I couldn't really even comprehend them. So I sat down and really talked to him and said, you know what? I need somebody like you, because if I don't know the answers why something's not growing in a certain area, even after soil tests, things like that, can you help me? And so, we talked for a while and then decided that, it'd be a great relationship to work with John because he has such an extensive background in brassicas and corns and beans and all the agronomy stuff, minerals, that he was fabulous to work with, or is fabulous to work with, and able to help when I myself don't have answers. I know I have somebody that is extremely knowledgeable and can help me get the right thing into my client's hands.
So John O'Brien, Grandpa Ray Outdoors is a good shout out for me from Whitetail Rendezvous and Art Helin. So let's go back and talk about the 4 phases, and we've got about 20 some minutes to go. So if we took 5 minutes each phase, I think that would be good, because deer are very vocal. If you spend any time in the woods, you've heard deer do some strange things and make some strange noises. And so Art's going to break it down for us, starting in September and going through November.
Well, so if you get into September, which I call the second phase, deer start, their antlers have already hardened. When their antlers are pretty much fully grown by the end of July. And then what happens after that is they start going through a phase where the antlers start to harden. Then the velvet starts to shrink. Once the antlers are fully hardened, the velvet shrinks. Then it becomes itchy and they rub this off. This whole process, their testosterone starts to build. As that testosterone builds, there's changes going through their body. And so their vocalizations is telling them different vocalizations. So once you get into that first part of September, mid-September, into the first part of October, what happens is these bucks start doing that and their testosterone levels grow, they start doing some sparring, or they have a lot of social grunts. And the reason that they do a lot of social grunting and light sparring at this time is because they're trying to find out, it's like your freshman year of high school, trying to find out who the big kid on the block is. So you want to find out, who the biggest senior is, or so you might have a couple of the kids sitting there fighting, and then the senior walks in and breaks it up and says, you know what, this is my hallway, stay out. It's no different with these deer. What he's doing is, because he's found his home range, and it might have been his home range for years, is he wants to know who's in that, or he wants to know who's in his bedroom. So as soon as he hears those antlers start tickling, or he hears a social buck grunt, that older mature deer is going to walk into that area out of curiosity to find out what buck is there, so he can show them certain postures, certain body language to tell them that, hey, I'm the more mature deer here. This is my territory. You're welcome to stay, but, just so you know, this is my area. So during that time frame, a lot of the social grunts, light sparring, once you've made contact with that deer, it's not like later on in the year when you can actually call, and do a lot of blind calling and have it successful. This is more of a close range. So once you make that contact with that deer, then you start calling this to try to draw that deer to you. So
let's talk about tickling and soft grunts. And do you do any leads at all during this first phase?
I will. The earlier in the season, I try to do some fawn bleats, and because as that buck again, as his testosterone starts to rise, he tries to push those fawns off that doe, because the sooner they quit nursing, the sooner that she comes back into heat, or so he thinks. She's going to dry up and come back into heat. So his natural instincts are try to push those away. So again, the curiosity doing that, your fawn bleats and balls, along with some real soft doe grunts, that curiosity. But with, then if you get past that and into a little bit later into that phase, when you start doing more of your social buck grunts and your rattling, you don't want to go crazy with it. You want to have either a small set of antlers, you want to have a rattle pack, something small like that that's going to sound like 1.5 or 2-year-old deer. You want to sound smaller, and you don't go all out. So it's, maybe 30 seconds, a minute, minute and a half, where you're just going to lightly tickle those antlers together and maybe throw in a few social grunts. And a social grunt is just bap, bap, bap. You're not going to be long, drawn out challenge grunts, anything like that this early in the year.
And then let's talk about, we're going to transfer into the second phase, and things get a little bit more serious now, don't they?
They do. There's a phase in there in between, which is the October lull that everybody really, not a lot of guys like the October lull. And the reason is because the October lull is more focused on protein for those deer and trying to put weight on and different things. So calling doesn't work real well unless you're real close. So the October lull, you still get out there because your chances of shooting something are obviously better in a tree than they are on the couch. That's the way it works. But once you get past that, now you start looking, you get into that October 25th to, mid-November time frame. And this is a fun time of year. This is what I call pre-rut. And this is when things start to really change and on deer, because they know that the rut is right around the corner. Things are going to start getting serious. You look at the rut prediction tables, things like that, and every year it's pretty much the same time. Things that affect it, moon phase, things like that, will affect how the deer move throughout that time frame. But the reality is it's all triggered on the length of day, the rut is. And then everything works around the moon, and it works around the weather and how they're going to move throughout that time frame.
Let's stop just for a second there. Let's stop and talk about how many articles there are starting in June, let's say, all the way through the fall. The rut's going to happen in your zone on this date, yada, yada, yada. What is all that about?
Well, and what they do is they look at, and they're right, but when they look at the moon phases and stuff, that's when the deer are going to move the most throughout those days. But if you really look at it, the rut, because it's all focused and it happens around the length of a day. So if you look at articles, that's when the time of the day hits a certain length. And every year that might change by just 1 or 2 days or 3 days. And then it all focuses around the moon phase. So it's really going to all be within the same couple days every year of when it's actually going to start. But what they're talking about is how the moon phase and how the weather, how things are going to affect that rut, and when they're really going to be on their feet during the best days of that time frame, when the days are real short.
And so, folks, the best thing I can tell you is go to the DNR and ask them, in my area, in my zone, when do the fawns drop? And then you can very easily cut all the way back to when they were impregnated. And then you correlate that with the moon and the length of day, the sunlight available to them, and all that, put it in a pile, put it in a pot, stir it up, and that should give you, what, a week's time or 5 days time?
Usually it gives you a little more than that, because the transition there is a little slower. So, I mean, if you look at that pre-rut, you're going to get a couple weeks in there, but then the actual breeding is usually, that 8 to 10 days. And again, there's always the anomaly. There's always something that's a little different here and there. One might come in earlier. We're talking the highest percentage. We're talking, the 90 to 95% range and higher, because there's always that one that'll throw it off, because as soon as I say this will never happen, it happens, so they're wild animals. So there's nothing that you can ever say that this never happens, because when you say that, it will happen and make you look like a fool. So, but I like the numbers where if you look at that and compile that year after year, that you're going to be in that 90% range every year at about the same time frame.
And thanks for that, because I know some people, they'll swear I got to be in my tree these 3 days and no other days during the rut. And sometimes I think that's silly because a lot of things change, especially the weather.
Right. And that's why that rut prediction is nice on that, because what they're looking at when they say these 3 days is that might be when the moon phase is the best. But if the weather is 70 degrees or 80 degrees, that plays a huge factor in it too. So then you have to look at it and say, okay, what's the next phase? Because the colder the weather, the more they're going to move throughout the day. Depending on the moon phase, that'll make them move more throughout the day than at night. And so that's what you're looking at when people say, I need to hunt these 5 days or these 3 days, is look at the moon phase first from the shortest days when it gets to that, say, October 25th to 28th, and then up to November 9th or 10th, you look at that and say, okay, so these days here are going to be my best days out of that 10-day time frame or 12-day time frame, and kind of play it around that with the moon phase and the weather then.
What about the lockdown? What's that all about?
Well, usually when it gets into lockdown time frame, lockdown gets that buck, your most mature bucks, and not always your most mature, but your breeder bucks, they're going to take that doe and they're going to grab her and they're going to take her out away and they're going to lock her down. So if she's really close to breeding or wanting to be bred, he's going to take her off and he's going to hold her down. It could be as short as an hour it could be, I've heard people say that up to 24 hours, they've seen them actually run out and hold that doe in place or not leave her. And sometimes they'll take them to the most secluded places you can find them. I've seen them take them out of the hardwoods and different places to the middle of a set-aside field or one tree on a fence line that's the farthest away from anybody that they're not going to get interrupted until they're done breeding. And so that buck that you've been chasing all year, you don't know where he might be on lockdown, gone with a doe somewhere and locked up, or he could be, could have ran her a mile away and not even on your property anymore.
So how do we hunt a lockdown buck?
Well, first, I guess, if to backtrack just a hair, onto that first season before you get into lockdown, you want to use the intimidation factor really during that time frame that I call the pre-rut. And during that time frame, you can use every call possible. I mean, at that time, I like to use snort wheezes, challenge grunts, tending grunts, estrus bleats, long drawn out buck fights with larger antlers, so you sound like that more mature deer when you're doing that. The thing with a snort wheeze, I never like to do that until I make contact with that deer, because they're mostly a mature deer call. And if you use it at the wrong time or use it blindly, they try to get downwind of you. So once you see that deer, you can try to draw him to the right wind side of you if possible. And then you're going to get in from, once you're done with that phase and having fun and calling and doing all this stuff, then right towards the end of that, when they start getting into lockdown, or what a lot of people call rut, which is the breeding season, now you really have to look at the jealousy factor of a deer, and you try to make him jealous. So a lot of your calls starting the 9th, 10th, 12th, somewhere right in that ballpark, if you're using those dominant calls anymore and trying to rattle and trying to do challenge grunts, a lot of those bucks won't respond anymore. What happens is those deer have one thing on their mind, because the days are getting shorter and the days are getting shorter. And so they're like, you know what, I don't want to fight anymore. I've done this, since day one. I know where things are. So now all of a sudden you switch gears and you say, all right, well, then I want to make him jealous. I'm in here with his girlfriends. So that's when I switch over to doing more tending grunts, estrus bleats with tending grunts. And again, once in a while, even throw in some fawn bleats with that doe, because now their mind is really playing tricks on them, saying, well, wait a minute, she shouldn't have fawns at all with her at this time of year. So I've really got to get those fawns away from her. So, you play on that factor of that deer and say, all right, I really want to use these calls during that time frame. And a lot of times that time frame, you're going to be that 10th of November to, the 20th, 25th of November. And then a lot of times, a lot of states, rifle season will start. And once rifle season starts, opening day, you may have a chance at still calling some deer. If you're in pretty secluded areas, you can do it for a while. But then a lot of times, if you're in the heavy pressured areas, you're pretty much done.
All bets are off.
Yep. So it's So that's what you got to look at is how you're breaking those two down and saying the earlier, you can really get aggressive because those deer are already patterned and you have them on the pattern. Now you can call them off that pattern to you and get super aggressive. Once they get into that lockdown, if you see that buck chasing that doe, and he's doing a tendon grunt, which sounds like he's popping it, pop, 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 as they're going, chasing that doe. Every step he takes, he's making a short little grunt. Then he'll do a try to get her stopped, and then he'll go right back into that popping sound. If you hear that and watch them physically doing that, now you can play that and try to hit him with an estrus bleat. I've got the Nightingale that I just turn over, and it's a can. You turn it over and let it do its thing. And then I'll go from there and start calling, with my tendon grunts and try to make him jealous and pull him off that doe. Because if she's not ready, if she's really close, he's not going to pull off of her. But if she's not ready and he's been chasing her, he knows it. His jealousy factor is in who else, if there's another doe that's hot in here, who is tending to her because this is my territory. Draw him off of her and make him come find out who it is.
So, folks, you're hearing Art say there's a lot of pieces to the puzzle, and at the Hour of Deer Classic, I've heard Bill Winke and a few other guys expound on hundreds of years of collectively of knowledge. And so if you get a chance next year, come on out here, because the show won't add till a couple of weeks after the show. But, stop by, check out Iowa Deer Classic. And let's move around to your second part of your seminar, and let's talk about that for the last 10 minutes or so of the show.
As far as like the land management work and, when you look at a piece of land, there's four pieces to that. There's your timber, there's your food, there's your water, and your cover. And when you look at your timber, there's a couple things that you look at. If you're working with certain foresters, a lot of foresters don't like hinge cutting. Hinge cutting works and is great for certain areas. It's great for funneling deer, doing certain things down south. It works a little better, but working with a lot of foresters and having some forestry background stuff, I listened to these guys and they would rather do what's called stump cuts. Because when you go into an area, you find trees that aren't any good, ironwoods, you find elm trees, you find stunted oak trees, different things that you just want out, dogwood, that these trees aren't good and you want better trees. So if you want more production out of your good oak trees, if you want walnuts or you want maples or different things, then what you have to do is you need to go in and stump cut these and get rid of them. What we do is when we'll stump cut that tree is I cut it and I just leave it lay. And the reason is that you want to do that between January 1st and April 1st. Because when you're in there stump cutting, which is different than hinge cutting you do later on. Because then what happens is when that comes back to life is it's saying, hey, there's nothing here. So it shoots a whole bunch of new sprouts out of the stump. And that is your new browse. That's your new cover. That's your new trees for that area. So for the first couple of years, it creates all this new habitat for bedding, for browse, and food all in one source. So, you got to look at how and where to do your certain TSI areas or your timber stand improvement work. Then, we move into different water sources, and I've looked at water. I work with a couple aquatic biologists, and we did some studies on why deer were walking through streams into ponds, into these small little 10 by 10, 15, 15, 20, 20 foot water sources that are 3.5, 4 feet deep. Well, we found out that there's a couple things. One, usually in a creek, they have to put their nose into it. So they're getting wind swirl, they're getting noise from the creek, so they're not as comfortable in there. These ponds you can build you can put those up on top of ridges. You can go in with a skid steer. You can dig it. Certain areas you can either put bentonite in if you've got a lot of clay. Otherwise, I like to use liners. That's a woven weave. It's a woven liner, very thin. It's got a 20-year guarantee that they're not going to poke holes in it. Then put a little mat on top of it. You lay that in there, and once you get that at that certain depth, you make it look as natural as you can. Put the dirt on top of it. You can get certain aquatic plants that'll grow to keep your water temperatures right, because once water hits 39 degrees on the bottom, so you have to be over that 3.5 feet deep in order to get it right. Once that hits that 39 degrees, it turns over and pulls all those natural minerals out of the soil, plant proteins that have been in there all year, and brings those back to the top in the spring. And so that gets your deer, your turkeys, your animals in there, and it's healthier for them. So you're giving them a lot healthier water. If you're using certain other materials to build them, you need to clean those. If you're using kiddie pools, things like that, every 2 years or so, you should be cleaning those out, digging those out and cleaning them. Otherwise, you get so much bacteria growth in them because they're so shallow and get so warm. They grow a lot of bacteria in them and then becomes non-healthy. So each year you can watch the numbers of deer that actually come to that diminish. Do they work? Yes. I'm not saying they don't work, because they do, but just make sure that you clean those out over time. Then, when you get done looking at those, food is a big thing, because, I touched on sanctuaries a little earlier, but with food, the biggest thing with that is trying to build a full 365-day food plot. And because so many people think as farmers, what happens is all of a sudden that food source, the first part of September or mid-September, first part of October, the leaves have fallen off the beans because they've become mature. The silk on the corn is hardened up or shrunk. The milk stage is gone in the corn. So now those deer, it's not as appetizing to them. They want those leaves. They want that silk. They want that milk stage. And so what else can you give them at that time? Because that's the time that we're out there hunting. So if we don't have something, so I try to divide food plots up or larger food plots. And one part of it, I always like to put in clover mixes, chicory, things like that, because then right away in the spring, throughout the summer, they have that as the other plants are growing. Then as I go in, I plant my beans and my corn. What I'll do is, especially now, Grandpa Ray's just came out with a new bean this year that is a very early maturing bean. So the leaves actually fall 2 to 3 weeks earlier than they normally do, which is nice because then I can get in an overseed to get in all my fall brassica mixes. When I get my fall brassica mixes in, what'll happen is those mixes then grow, so why those beans become, non-tasty, if you want to put it that way, I guess, to the deer. They just don't like them as much during that time frame, which they want those again later on in the winter. But during this time frame, they want that green because they need that tonnage to get them through winter. So I've got to find as much green as I can. Well, sometimes the clover and chicory just isn't enough and doesn't have enough tonnage in it. And so I look at brassica mixes that have rape, turnips, rutabagas, there's winter wheats, different things in there, so they get that green. So now all of a sudden, even with that clover becomes dormant, say we get some really good hard frost and becomes dormant in November, now all of a sudden you have all this other greens and turnips and stuff like that the deer just migrate to that, stay on the same food source. So now you have food sources that bring them from spring through summer into that mid-fall, and now you have leftover stuff with your turnips, radishes, corn, and beans for the rest of the winter to get them through until spring. Then when you go start tilling that ground up, now you're right back over to the clovers and the chicories again, keeping those deer there. So you start thinking like that full 365 days. Think like a deer farmer instead of a farmer.
So, folks, you've heard this before on Whitetail Rendezvous. If you really want to get in this game and hunt mature deer, one, you got to have mature deer on your property and hold them there. Yeah, you're going to have some other deer come and go during the rut, but for the most part, if you have food, shelter, and water 365 days a year, you're going to keep the holding capacity on your land. So, Art, thank you so much for being on the show. Why don't you give a couple of shout outs and then we'll wrap the show.
Well, thank you. I thank, the guys here at Iowa Deer Classic, obviously, for having me out here to speak. I've got a few other shows, that I got to go do. And so, I just, I said thank you to all the listeners for listening to Bruce's show. And again, everybody that I've dealt with, the companies I deal with, and I guess the biggest shout out I got to give to my wife because she deals with this day in and day out, and she travels to all the shows with me and helps put the seminars and everything else together. And she hunts and loves to hunt and fish. So I guess my biggest shout out has to go out to her. So, but I thank you, Bruce, and appreciate your time.
So on behalf of Whitetail Rendezvous on site at Iowa Deer Classic 2017. Art, Helin, thank you so much for being a guest and look forward to another show, possibly in Madison, but we'll catch up to you someplace down the line.
On the next episode of Whitetail Rendezvous, we're going to visit with Nick Piercy. Nick is the owner of Killer Food Plots. What's so killer about Killer Food Plots? Well, if you listen to the show, you're going to find out Nick has spent his lifetime growing big deer. preparing the soil. And as he says, you reap what you sow. And he sure does reap some big bucks. Listen up. It's going to be fun.
Thanks for joining us. Be sure to tune in tomorrow for another episode of Whitetail Rendezvous, where you can listen and learn from the experts so you can be more successful on your next hunt. Until next time, listen, learn, and succeed.